Hi there, I'm Machine Pun Kelly. Thanks for watching. Today I want to start a conversation about the history of the Supreme Court's decisions on whether undocumented immigrants have due process rights. So let's get going. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The U.S. Supreme Court has established that undocumented immigrants are entitled to due process protections under the Fifth and 14th Amendments because they apply to all persons within U.S. jurisdiction per the wording of the Constitution. 6 pertinent cases establish this history. Let's review them in chronological order. First up is Yick versus Hopkins. In the late 19th century, San Francisco had a significant Chinese immigrant population, driven by labor demands during the gold rush and railroad construction. By 1880, about 21,000 Chinese residents lived in the city, roughly 10% of the population. Anti-Chinese sentiment was rampant, fueled by economic competition and racial prejudice. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese immigration, reflected this hostility. Local ordinances often targeted Chinese communities to restrict their economic and social activities. Laundries, a common occupation for Chinese immigrants, became a flashpoint. Most laundries in San Francisco were Chinese-operated, often in wooden buildings due to affordability, making them vulnerable to discriminatory regulations. In 1880, San Francisco passed an ordinance requiring laundries to obtain a permit from the Board of Supervisors to operate in wooden buildings, citing fire safety. The ordinance gave the board broad discretion to grant or deny permits without clear criteria. While facially neutral, the ordinance was enforced discriminatorily. Historical records show that nearly all Chinese-owned laundries were denied permits, while most non-Chinese, primarily white-owned laundries received them. The parties involved were Yick and Sheriff Hopkins. Yick was a Chinese immigrant who operated a laundry in San Francisco for over 20 years. He had complied with fire and safety inspections, but was denied a permit by the Board of Supervisors. Sheriff Hopkins, who represented San Francisco's enforcement of the ordinance, arrested Yick for operating without a permit. Yick was one of approximately 200 Chinese laundry owners denied permits, while about 80 non-Chinese owners were granted permits. Only one Chinese applicant received approval. In 1885, Yick was arrested, convicted, and fined $10 for violating the ordinance. Refusing to pay, he was imprisoned for 10 days. He challenged his conviction, arguing the ordinance was applied in a discriminatory manner, violating his rights under the 14th Amendment. The California courts upheld his conviction, prompting an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. There were 2 issues at stake. Did the San Francisco Ordinance, as applied, violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against Chinese immigrants? Did the ordinance's arbitrary enforcement deprive Yick of due process by denying him the ability to pursue his livelihood without fair standards? The Supreme Court overturned the conviction, declaring the ordinance unconstitutional due to its discriminatory enforcement. It found that the ordinance was enforced with an evil eye and an unequal hand, targeting Chinese immigrants. Despite its neutral language, the stark disparity in permit approvals showed intentional discrimination, violating the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Due process. The court held that the ordinance's arbitrary application, lacking clear standards for permit decisions, deprived Yick of his property via his business without due process. The board's unchecked discretion allowed for unfair treatment. Key quote: "The 14th Amendment to the Constitution is not confined to the protection of citizens. Its provisions are universal in their application to all persons within the territorial jurisdiction, without regard to any differences of race, of color, or of nationality." Yick Hopkins was a groundbreaking case, explicitly extending 14th Amendment protections to non-citizens. It established that all persons within U.S. jurisdiction, regardless of citizenship or immigration status, are entitled to due process and equal protection. This laid the foundation for later cases affirming rights for undocumented immigrants, such as Wong Wing v. United States, 1896, and Plyler v. Doe, 1982. The case introduced the principle that laws neutral on their face can violate equal protection if enforced discriminatorily. This concept remains critical in modern civil rights law, influencing cases involving racial profiling, voting rights, and more. It was one of the earliest cases to address systemic discrimination through statistical evidence, disparate permit outcomes, setting a precedent for proving intent in discrimination claims. The ruling curbed unchecked administrative discretion, emphasizing that government actions must follow fair, transparent standards to satisfy due process. This principle applies broadly, from local ordinances to federal regulations. The decision invalidated San Francisco's discriminatory laundry ordinance, allowing Chinese-owned businesses to operate without unfair restrictions. It was a rare victory for Chinese immigrants during a period of intense anti-Chinese legislation. However, enforcement of the ruling was uneven, as local authorities often found other ways to target Chinese communities, such as health or zoning regulations. Yick remains a cornerstone of constitutional law, cited in cases involving discrimination and due process. For example, it influenced Plyler v. Doe, 1982, which protected undocumented children's access to education, and modern challenges to discriminatory policing practices. It shaped immigration law by affirming that non-citizens within U.S. borders have constitutional protections, a principle reaffirmed in cases like Zadvydas v. Davis, 2001. The case is frequently cited in debates over immigration enforcement, particularly when policies appear to target specific groups, e.g., sanctuary city disputes or deportation practices. Posts on X discussing Yick often highlight its role in protecting immigrant rights, though some argue its scope is limited compared to modern enforcement challenges, like expedited removal. The ruling focused on discriminatory enforcement rather than striking down the ordinance itself, leaving room for governments to craft new regulations that could indirectly target minorities. While a win for Chinese immigrants, the case did not dismantle broader anti-Chinese laws like the Exclusion Act, and systemic discrimination persisted. Modern challenges. Some scholars note that Yick protections are less effective in contexts like border enforcement, where cases like Department of Homeland Security v. Thuraisigem, 2020, limit due process for recent arrivals. Conclusion. Yick v. Hopkins, 1886, arose from San Francisco's discriminatory targeting of Chinese immigrants through a laundry ordinance, reflecting the era's anti-Chinese hostility. The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling struck down the ordinance's unequal enforcement, affirming that non-citizens are entitled to due process and equal protection under the 14th Amendment. This landmark case curbed arbitrary government power, set a precedent for challenging discriminatory practices, and remains a foundational authority for protecting immigrant rights. Once again, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, aka MPK. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch the next chapter,